Genesis 37, and by way of the beginning here, I want to begin reading in verse 1, and we're just going to go to verses 1 through 11. Jacob lived in a land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So as you can see, Joseph is a bit of a tattletale already. Now Israel, that's Jacob, also another name for him, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak even a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." Nice, huh? His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream, because of what he said. Then he had another dream. When he told it to his brothers, "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you've had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but watch this. But his father kept the matter in mind. Let's pray. God, thanks for stories in your word that as we look at these, we are encouraged when we see that there are people that go through similar things that we go through. And yet you show us stories of how you pulled them through. Father, I know there are so many handling so many different things today. Perhaps, as we'll see in this story, they have been let down, betrayed. Maybe there are others who have sold them out, others who haven't believed in them, and yet they've carried a dream with them, and sometimes because of others, they let that dream go. Father, I pray today that as we look at this, that you will help us to understand this power of forgiveness in us as we move ahead, seeking to find our why. So we pray your blessings now as we continue to study your word and look at this story, and we'll thank you for it in Christ's name. Amen. I had occasion within the past couple of weeks to meet another pastor, and I don't normally spend a lot of time with other pastors just because of all the things that I'm doing. And we happened to have been in the same place at the same time, and he reminded me that we'd actually met one another. And so then, of course, as always happens, their discussions start with, "How are things at your church?" And me, I'm like, "Hey, listen, I got it good, I really do." And then, of course, then when you tell them that, then people are kind of like, "Oh." He went on to tell me about a church split that they had, and this huge auditorium that they had are now down to less than 200 people at one campus and less than 30 people at another campus, but yet there was a lot of infighting and there was a church split. Now, if you are fortunate enough to have never been through that, you're good. You don't ever want to go through it because they're not any fun. The joke used to be about Baptist churches when somebody, people make a joke like, I'm going to make like a tree and leave, you make stupid jokes like that. But those people that were in Baptist circles would say, I'm going to make like a Baptist church and split instead of a banana and split, because there was always splitting over various things that happened. And a lot of it, most of it, everybody, anytime there was a church split, it had to do with truth. It had to do with values. It had to do with doing what's right. And then you find out later that there was his side, her side, and the right side. There's always two sides to the story. But what always happens in that is betrayal. And I could look in this person's face, and I could look at him and see that all the wind was gone. That it was effectively, this dream of being at this place was pretty well gone. Now, I'm sure that perhaps, I guarantee you, I'm positive, I guarantee you that he probably contributed to it. You know how I know that? Because he's human. In fact, I bet you all the people that stayed and left, including the leadership, all contributed to it. But you see, when these kinds of things happen in life, it takes a dream that we had, and if we let it, that dream will be totally destroyed, especially when we think that that dream is something that is so far above everything else. We're thinking, oh my Lord, maybe this isn't from God. Or maybe something happens and it derails it. And often what happens is it's derailed by people. Sometimes it's derailed by the people who are closest to us. And when we let it derail us, what winds up happening is we wind up not forgiving them. We hold on to the pain. The dream is gone, and we don't accomplish anything that God wants us to accomplish, or very little. We certainly don't accomplish His best. If there's ever a story about that, it's the story of Joseph. I love the story of Joseph. We've looked at it before, but every time I look at it, there's something kind of new that I see in this. And so I want to talk to you about this issue and this person of Joseph for a little bit this morning. And we're kind of just going to go through the story, and I'm going to hit the high points and the low points. Because if you watch Joseph's life, it's like what could be, what is. What could be, what is. Sound familiar? What could be, what is. What could be, what is. You know how that goes. But you think how things could be, and you think, man, it could be like this, and all of a sudden it's like, what is. So let's talk about Joseph for a moment. You read it, you followed along with me, and so you saw the first part of the story, because Joseph there was some leadership qualities in him, no doubt. But probably as a teenager, I guarantee you the dude was irritating, because he probably thought he knew everything. He knew he was daddy's favorite. I'm not going to ask you how many of you were the favorite, or how many of you think that your brother or sister was the favorite. I know who the favorite was in my family. Just kidding. But you think about it, you know, that here was a guy who his dad had actually let his brothers know, hey, in no uncertain terms, he's my favorite. In fact, he made this multicolored robe for Joseph. And so Joseph sees his brothers aren't doing what's right. And he goes, hey, Dad, listen, I got to tell you something. You know, my other brothers here, they're not. And so he goes looking for them. And meanwhile, he has this dream. And you saw the dream. 2 dreams. One they're out there in the field, they're binding the sheaves, and all of a sudden, all the sheaves of his brothers about, they stand up, and then they bow down to him while he's standing there. And that just irritated the dickens out of his brothers. Now, would it irritate you if your brother or sister said, well, guess what? I just want to let you know I had this dream, and you were bowing down to me. Then it gets worse. He does this whole sun and moon and stars thing, and this guy got the universe. Now he thinks the universe revolves around him. And you see this dream, and you're thinking to yourself, what does it matter with this kid? He's got delusions of grandeur. And his dad even rebukes him, and he says, Joseph, what are you doing? You think that your mother and I are going to bow down to you? What are you, nuts? And then Jacob turned away, and he left it in the back of his mind. Same language here. In Hebrew is the same thing that was said about Mary when the shepherds came and said he's the Messiah. Said everything that they had learned. And it says that Mary pondered all these things in her heart. She kept it back there. Jacob keeps it back here. Well, we can't read the story, but I want to encourage you to read the story. I'm going to hit high points, low points, because high point, he's got a dream. We all get them, don't we? We start out, especially when we're young, we have these dreams of all these things that we're going to accomplish. What our work career is going to be like, what our education is going to be like, what our relationships are going to be like, what our children are going to be like. We had all of these incredible dreams of what it's going to be like. And sometimes we make the mistake of telling people what those dreams are. And some of the people around us, especially our family, go, but sometimes it gets irritating enough where they get so irritated by it, other action is taken. So finally, one day, as he goes out there to find his brothers, they see him coming, and they start talking to one another and said, oh, look, here comes the dreamer. That's what they called him. Here comes the kid whose head is in the clouds that thinks we are going to bow down to him. And they start talking among them, the brothers. And you know what they decided to do? They decided they were going to throw him into a pit. There was some discussion about murdering him. And one brother goes, no, we can't do that. And all of a sudden he sees some nomads coming along the way. And he's like, I got an idea. They decided he wants to dream. He thinks we're going to bow down to him. I'll tell you what, we're going to make some money off of this dude. And they sold him into slavery, took the coat, killed a goat, put some blood on it, and took it home to their dad. Can you imagine? And said, we're sorry, Dad, Joseph's dead. Could you imagine your sibling doing that to your parent? They're making it up. And your parent literally believing that you're dead. So you've got Jacob the dreamer, and now Jacob is wound up into, or not Jacob, but Joseph is wound up now in the bottom of this pit. He comes out of the pit. He's sold into slavery. Things go from bad to worse. His dad now thinks he's dead. They're going on their merry way. And so here goes Joseph, sold into slavery, and suddenly he's here. But then he sees what could be, because what he decides to do is just do what he's supposed to do, and he winds up in a place called Potiphar's house. Potiphar was way up the pecking order under Pharaoh. And so he keeps working and he keeps working and he keeps working. He's going up, and Potiphar takes notice, because what Joseph decided to do is, I better bloom where I'm planted. This thing isn't working out quite the way the dream was here. You know, this thing about everybody bowing down to me, but they sold me out, and now here I am, and I got to make the best of this situation. Potiphar took notice and went, this Hebrew kid, look at him. He's got some talent. He's got some grit. He's got some management skills. And so Potiphar pulls Joseph in, who was sold into slavery, who should have been the bottom guy on the rung. All of a sudden he says to him, I'm putting you in charge of everything in my house. You're the guy. Nothing is going to happen here in this house, with the exception of between me and my wife. Nothing else is going to happen without you managing it and without you knowing about it. Dreamer, down into the pit, sold into slavery. What could be? Wow. He's gone from a slave to being a stakeholder in Potiphar's house. But you know, when things get really good, they don't stay good forever, do they? Because you can have people sell you out. Then you can have people sell you out even worse and make false accusations against you. Anybody ever had that? I have, big time. And so it goes. See, because Potiphar's wife took a liking to Joseph. Apparently he was a good-looking guy, and she was like, hey, Joseph, come here. Joseph said, nah. She goes, no, hey, Joseph, come here. Let's talk a little bit. But it was going to be, the talking was going to be her and him behind closed doors in her room. And so Joseph denies her again. Finally, one day, she gets a hold of him and says, I want you now. And as she did, you can see this guy going, oh no. And he's kind of wriggling out of this cloak that he has. And he leaves the cloak behind and he runs as far away as he can. Because he said to her, I can't do this evil and sin against God. Your husband has put me in charge of everything in your household, but not you. It's you and him. It's not you don't belong to me. I don't have a relationship with you, and I can't do this evil and sin against God. So he kind of worms his way out of this cloak, and the cloak is left there, and suddenly Potiphar's wife went, So she yells for the servants and says, this Hebrew, notice how they starts calling him names because he's different nationality. So the Hebrew is trying to make a mockery of us against them. And she says, and look, he left in such a hurry, he left his coat here. So, as typical, Potiphar comes home and goes, oh yeah, this dude's in trouble. And says, that's it. And he put him in prison. Now, prison, I'm not saying prison today is great, but I'm just going to tell you that prison then, compared to prison now, today's a cakewalk. He's in a like a dungeon. Now, meanwhile, as he's down there in this dungeon, and we don't necessarily know for how long, we can make some speculation. The cupbearer of the king and the baker of the king had, gotten themselves into some trouble, and so they were imprisoned down there. Now, Joseph was always the dreamer. And so out comes these two guys, and they're all talking because there's not much, they don't get to get an education or anything like that. So they're talking with one another, and these guys have dreams, and they start talking to Joseph, and somehow they started talking to him. They believed him, and so they told him what their dreams were. And Joseph says to the baker, he goes, listen, this is going to happen. The cupbearer, he goes, this is what's going to happen with you. And so suddenly they were like, really? Is this really going to happen? And it started to happen. And Joseph said, hey, by the way, listen, when you get out, if all this takes place, and I know it will because it's God that's interpreting this, not me, remember that I'm here. Remember the injustice that was done to me. Because I didn't do anything, and I wound up here, and I've been falsely imprisoned, and I was falsely accused. So please, while you go, remember what I did for you. And of course, they went, and nothing. One was killed, as Joseph said. The other continued to serve the king. But the king had a problem. He couldn't sleep one night because he had a nasty, nasty dream. And he couldn't figure out what it was. He pulls all of his magicians together, all of his wisest people together, and they're like, what does this mean? They didn't know. And the baker goes, oh, hey, wait a minute, excuse me. What was that guy's name? I was in prison with him. Oh, gosh. He told me everything was going to happen. Joseph. Hey, king, you need to talk to Joseph. And so they go after Joseph, and Joseph gets all cleaned up, and he comes before the king, and he says, the king says, I hear that you can interpret dreams. And he says, not me, but God will do it. What does this mean? And so Joseph tells him, well, what this means, king, is that there's going to be 7 great years and 7 years of famine, and you better get ready. And the king went, wow. So he trusted Joseph. So Joseph, who was a dreamer, that wound up in the pit, that winds up at Potiphar's house over it, that winds up back in the pit again, in the dungeon, has now pulled out by the king, and he's put in charge of everything with the king's. In fact, he's called the governor. A Hebrew guy is a governor. Now, have you ever wanted to get back at somebody that wronged you? Be honest. Maybe. You want to be able to go back and go, ah! Look at me now. The famine starts in the land. Meanwhile, over here is Jacob and Joseph's brothers. Jacob finally says to his sons, you better get over there. And they got something going on there. We maybe could get some grain so we don't starve. And so he sends his brothers. Guess who they have to see? 3 guesses. First 2 don't count. Joseph. They walk in and they don't recognize him. But Joseph sees them. He recognizes them. Now I want you to hold that thought for a minute. What would you do? Because I know what I'd do. I'd go, ha! Now, I'd like to think I wouldn't, but I probably would. Maybe I wouldn't. But here they are. And so Joseph now plays around with them a little bit, and he makes them leave and come back and go get the younger brother. And finally, it comes to a point where Joseph can't hold it anymore. After several encounters and putting them in jail for a couple of days, and finally he looks at them and he goes, and he sends everybody out of the room. And he's looking at his brothers now, and he says to them, I am Joseph. And they all went, oh, and they hugged him. No. Because you see, what they remembered was the first time that they walked in to see the governor, to ask him about wheat and food, is they bowed to him. And now he says, it's me. The scriptures tell us that they were like, could you imagine what was running through their mind? Really? They sold him into slavery. They lied about him. They told his dad he was dead. And now he's the only thing that stands between them and starvation. And now he's told them weeping, I am your brother. And so then they go and they get Jacob, and Jacob comes, and of course they embrace, and everything is going along, and so they're able to move in, and they give them land, and so Joseph is taking care of them, and then suddenly Jacob gets sick and he dies. Now, you ever heard of people, if there's a feud going on in the family, that wait to do something until the last parent dies? I've actually seen that happen. You wait till they're gone, then I'm going to deal with you. I'm not going to do anything while mom's alive. I'm not going to do anything while dad's alive. But when they're gone, look out. Their father dies. And so now it hits a crescendo. Because they're like, what now? Wait a minute, Dad's gone. This is it. Now, he was honoring Dad. Joseph's going to kill us now. And we jump over to Genesis 50, verses 15 and 21. Here it is, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you, listen, to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs that they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to Joseph, he wept. I don't know that would be my reaction. I'm just saying. I would be missing my father, but I'm not so sure that I probably would ultimately forgive them, but I'd probably want to rub their nose in it just a little longer. I'm just being human. If you're above that, then more power to you. You can preach next week. But I think I'd probably want to just twist just a little bit. Verse 18, here it is again. His brothers then, here, listen to this. Let this sink in. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him and said, we are your slaves. What could be the dreamer, the pit, and slavery. Potiphar, falsely accused, injustice, winds up in prison, asks these guys to remember him, and they forgot him. What could be? He's the governor now. His life was a struggle of up and down, of conflict, of pain, of betrayal, of injustice, of false accusations, of jealousy, of abandonment and people forgetting about him. And now he's got the opportunity to right the wrong. And they throw themselves down in front of him and said, we're your slaves. But here it is, verse 19. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Here it is. This is the verse. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done. Underline it. The saving of lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them, and I love this. And it says, and he spoke kindly to them. Do you remember what we read all the way back in verse 37? That they did not have a kind word to speak to him. Remember, that was in verse 4 of chapter 37. They had not a kind word to say to Joseph when he was the dreamer early on. And now it says Joseph looks at them and says, wait a minute, listen, I'm not in the place of God. And what you meant for harm, God intended for good, because he had a bigger purpose, and that was to save the lives of all of these people. He's used every bit of conflict, every bit of pain, every bit of stuff that I've been through, everything that you intended to go wrong in my life, he took it and he's used it. I am not in the place of God. And then it says he not only reassured them that everything was going to be okay, what he said to them were kind words. The exact opposite of what they had done. Joseph knew his why. We're talking about finding your why. I don't know that he actually knew his why early on, because it started with this kind of weird dream that everybody was bowing down to him. As a kid, it started like over here. And it's easy when it starts over here and you think things are going to go one particular way and then it goes bad. And often what we do is we abandon it and we get bitter when we get down here, when we think what could be, but then what is. We usually get bitter in the what is. We usually get bitter in the betrayal. We usually get bitter in the jealousy. We usually get bitter in the abandonment. We usually give up there and say that's it. And what we wind up doing is we wind up living in the place of what is instead of what could be. And sometimes we don't do our best. Sometimes we just give up and we say, that's it. I'm just going to exist here. And what Joseph said was, okay, this was bad. My family sold me out. I'm all alone here, but I'm just going to continue to progress and move and do the best and be the best that I can be. And suddenly what happens in the midst of this, he gets elevated. But you got to watch when you get elevated, folks. The moment that you get elevated, somebody's going to try to take you down again. And it may not be true. And so he winds up in prison. From the pit to prison. And as people forget about him again, but you know what? He kept going and he kept going and he kept going. And all of a sudden he gets to that definitive moment. And I'm going to tell you that I believe what happened to Joseph at that moment was he had already forgiven his brothers a long time ago, because if not, he would have been living in that pain and never been able to progress through that pain to get where he needed to go. And that's really the issue, isn't it? When we are in a place of not being able to forgive, we literally have to let God's purpose pull us through the pain. Because I got news for you about the pain. It's going to happen. If you've had people let you down, more people are going to let you down. If you've had people that abandon you, more people are going to abandon you. If you've had people that have said nasty things about you, there's more people that are going to say nasty things about you, especially the higher up in leadership that you go. It's going to happen. You could either decide to get bitter in that place that you are with those people and hang on to it and think about retribution and how am I going to get back at these people and how can I pay them back and get revenge? Or we could take the purpose that God has for us and let it pull us through that pain and deal with this issue of forgiving them and letting go of the pain so that we can move into what he has for us. But it ain't going to be easy. Joseph had to keep progressing, as we talked about last week, through the pain. So my question is, what do you have this morning? Are you living in what is or what could be? Like, who, if I don't know their name, but there's one or two people, maybe three or four, that the very mention of their name you can feel it right here. It's deep. And we can feel the swirling inside. And we wonder, why did this happen? And we get a picture of them, and we even think sometimes in the still of the night, I wonder if that voodoo doll thing really works. But what's happened is we're living in the pain of what they did to us. And we're so caught up in the pain, and we're so living in that swirling of the pain, that we're not being pulled towards a purpose. What helped? His perspective. His perspective when all this was over was, wait a minute, God, you wanted to harm me. Folks, there are people that want to harm you. I'm not telling you to be paranoid. There are people that want to harm you. There always will be. There will be people that are going to try to harm you in some way. Maybe it's not because of what you did. Maybe it's because of who they are. But they're going to try to harm you. They're going to try to take you down. They're going to try to take you out. Maybe not physically, but they'll try to take you out of your position. They'll try to keep you down. It's going to happen. But he says, what you meant to harm me, God intended to not only use, but pulled me through all of this so that now lives are being saved. Somehow he was able to keep God's perspective on the situation. That's why you see this issue of forgiveness over and over and over in the New Testament. Peter came to Jesus and said, hey, how many times should I forgive my brother? He said 7 times. That was rabbinical law. He said, no, 70 times 7. So how do you forgive? God, I wish I had an answer. Really? So he says, pray, do this, do that. It means to cease to hold resentment against an offender. I've often told people that really it's verbalizing it, it's confessing it to somebody, it's getting it out and saying, listen, I need to forgive this person. But then continuing to walk towards the purpose, because what happens is we don't feel like forgiving, and we have our feelings and we live by our feelings instead of the fact that we have to somehow keep moving forward through the pain. If it's something that happened that was horrific to you, then maybe you need to talk to somebody else that's a professional that can help you work through it. But you got to get out of the pain to get to the purpose. Because you can live in what could be, or you can live in what is. In the end, Jacob said, Joseph, I want you to forgive him. And I wish if Joseph were here, he'd probably tell us, I already had. I wouldn't have been able to get through what I got through if I hadn't. You think about the people that he had to forgive in his life. His brothers. Potiphar's wife for the false accusations. The people that left him in prison that said, no, we're not going to forget about you. And he was there. God's purpose pulled him through the pain. And it can pull you and I through the pain too.